Oh, so exciting. Hey everyone, welcome to this month's Torch Talks. I'm Alissa Walker, your host, and I do my promotional items here. You too could have one of these stickers if you become a paid subscriber to Torch. We talk about mega events here, the good, the bad, the ugly. And today I think we're going to talk about a lot of the ugly, but then what some good ideas might be to get ahead of the potential very bad uh, possibilities that might be confronting us as we head into this era. I'm so pleased to have our guest here today. Neil was my editor for a short time at Curbed. RIP, the our old archives of Curbed. But you could search on the Wayback Machine to find
Exactly.
stories we worked on together. Always appreciated the way that he could synthesize big ideas, but also just make them very relevant to the people of the cities that we live in. And I think that that will come through in his analysis of our very troubling deal that we've made with LA 28 is a good way to put it. And Chris, a longtime admirer and collaborator as far as working on great stories about SAJE and all the great work they're doing in South LA. So let you both introduce yourselves and then I'll just start asking. And you could, why don't you start by just explaining the report, which I'll drop in the comments, and how it came about.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Tyler. I am a communications manager at SAJE. SAJE stands for Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. We are a nonprofit organization. We have been in South Central LA for 30 years now, but we do work not just in the community, but also all around the city and greater LA County. And a lot of our work focuses on tenant rights, equitable development and land use, and climate justice. But at the end of the day, we're an economic justice organization. And fundamentally, we want to see public resources being used to equitably and justly benefit the people who live in the city, especially people who live in communities like South Central that have suffered from decades of disinvestment. And so therein lies our connection to the Olympics LA Coalition, which we have been a member of since 2017 when the coalition was formed to oppose the bid that was then being negotiated by Eric Garcetti and the city council. And the coalition exists to both mitigate the harms of the 2028 Olympics, analyze and socialize the research and the findings that we come across as we keep tabs on everything that's going on in preparation for the event. And fundamentally, we are trying to advocate for the cancellation of the games, which feels like a very big ask. We understand that that is something that a lot of people consider to be impossible. And so that is why we commissioned this report with Neil to look at this question of whether or not this is actually an impossible feat. And if it is, what do we stand to lose by hosting these games? And if it's not, what kinds of conversations, what kinds of advocacy, what kinds of questions do we need to be asking right now to understand better what the possibilities are?
And I'm Neil deMause, and I am a longtime journalist and researcher who has been working when I'm not when I've not been editing Alyssa, and even when I was editing Alyssa, on researching and writing about sports and economics. So when Sage approached me and asked me to look into this question, I was like, oh, I've written and studied a lot about the Olympics as a perfect opportunity to really dive deep into this. And we can obviously talk more about the details, but the short answer seems to be that no one knows, I mean, the last time that anybody tried to cancel Olympics was Denver in 1972, and no one has really tested it since then. So there are some theories that we can, some estimates we can make and some th concerns that we can raise, both about holding the Olympics and about not holding the Olympics. But a lot of it is going to come down to, if LA wants to try to even modify its deal for the Olympics or try to get some concessions, it would have to see and find out.
And that's why I love the title of it is damned if you do, damned if you don't, because I think this is what we're really caught up in right now in this moment, right? There's been a lot of news over the last 2 weeks. We could talk a little bit more about that. And I thought Neil's take on that was really good. Um, but really, like we've been promised now that this is going to help us as a city, and we know that there could be good economic benefits that come from it. But is it worth the very serious, I don't know, just potential bankruptcy of the city to achieve those? Talk a little bit about the title and how you landed on that as the takeaway.
I mean, that's sort of just where it ended up, right? Was the more I started looking into it and looking into, again, what was the downside of, well, there is a significant downside to trying to back out, right? At this point, if LA had done what Tom Bradley did in 1978 for the 1984 Olympics and had said, okay, we are just not going to agree to cover all the cost overruns. We're not going to be the backstop on this thing. LA can't afford that. The Olympics need us. We don't need them. We're just going to say no. And the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, kept pressuring him, and he was like, you know what? Fine, we're just not going to hold the Olympics, and they backed down. And so, one of the many good things about the '84 Olympics was that LA was not on the hook, and the IOC and the Olympic Committee and Peter Ueberroth, all had to figure out ways to balance their books because there was nobody else who was going to do it for them. So the time to do that now would have been in, what was it, 2017, I think, when Mayor Garcetti was first negotiating this. And that was not what he did, right? I mean, there was no real rush to sign an agreement. They were, were announcing the 2024 Olympics for Paris, and the Olympic Committee decided to announce 2028 at the same time. The LA officials could easily have said, "Well, hold on a minute, let's wait until we've got a deal that we can work out." But the mayor and the council both said, "Well, the IOC said they won't agree to it unless we're the backstop. So guess we have to do that." So that puts us in a bad situation, right? Because now you've got a contract and you have to figure out how to break it, and no one really knows how much it could cost. It could be billions of dollars, easily. However, when we look at the history of Olympics, that it could easily be billions of dollars, on the other side. And typically the cost overruns for an Olympic Games when you count security and traffic and like all the different things that you have to pay for. Um, it ends up being about double or more what the initial estimate is. So if that were to happen with LA, you could be caught talking $6 or $7 billion that LA 28 does not have, and that they would then turn to LA and say, okay, well, you signed a contract saying you're on the hook for this, so we would like our $7 billion now, please. So damned if you do, damned if you don't really kind of just popped right up,
What
right? Because
up?
that's
Yeah.
exactly where you are when you, and again, this is not LA is not alone here, right? It's been the case for every single Olympics, pretty much since '84, that you get to a certain point and your city is stuck because it feels too late to back out, or at least back out easily. Yet at the same time, you can just see, the train, the onrushing train coming, and there's no way to get off the tracks.
And hopefully there will be a train as one of our things that we're still waiting for that D line to get finished. But I think there's just two really important things I just want to highlight before we go to Chris is that the difference is, we've been told games have LA's games have always turned a profit. Like that's like what you learn when you move here. They like give you like a card that says, be sure to, support the Olympics. We're the only place that made it profitable. We The difference between 84 and now is what you said. Like there was a charter amendment basically made that said we couldn't do that. We couldn't be the backstop. And this time we decided to be the backstop. So that's very, very important to understand the different situation that we're in. And then also, as we're talking about budget, you may hear the budget of LA 28 being, top 7 billion something. I don't know. They just raised it a little bit over 7 billion. That is just for producing the games themselves, like the actual things that happen in the venues, maybe a few other things. There's all this other stuff that the city has already paid for, including like staff time that we don't know about. We don't know what that budget is. We don't have a list of projects. We don't have really anything to go on there.
And the city in LA 28 won't tell us.
Well, is Yeah, I mean, does the city even know? LA 28 is probably not going to tell us, but like, is the city?
Right. Well, no, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think city is keeping track. I mean,
yeah,
that
right.
seems pretty clear when
Yeah,
I have asked, they were like, oh yeah, we don't know
yeah.
that. How much staff time we're spending on that? What are you crazy?
They should be
We
tracking that.
require
Okay.
some sort of accounting system.
Yeah, well, we have that. Chris, thoughts here.
Well, not even does the city not know, but LA 28 and the city can't come to agreement on what these, enhanced city resources are going to cost. And there's a lot of conflict right now from what we understand in the Olympics LA that there's a lot of disagreement. The city may be trying to sue LA 28 because they can't come to a set. I think they're trying to define at what rate city services will be billed, whether it's a 2024 rate or a 2028 rate, knowing that inflation is rising and things are just becoming more and more expensive. The budget is just ballooning and ballooning. There's no one really being accountable to it, and everybody is just kind of playing past the, like hot potato right now with the numbers.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting when you look at the services agreement, which I have been trying to, we had this, I wrote about it, when it was still getting decided. It's overdue. It was due in October. It has it, the negotiations are ongoing. And I think one thing that's just like really, really striking when you read through the games agreement, and I'm sure Neil can quote all this like in his sleep. Um, we are actually trying to raise the comparison is actually the service levels that we had in 2022. So think about how much better service deployment was happening in 2022 when we had like COVID money left, still coming. We had like a better, staffed, city services. So we are trying to get up to here with millions of people being here. I'm just thinking of the trash alone, which keeps me up at night, worried about this. And we're down here, and the services agreement was supposed to be here. So who's making up that big deficit, right?
Right. And then on top of that, if the city does successfully bill LA 28 for, I don't know, $1 billion in city services, right? And LA 28 doesn't have it. Hey, guess what? Who has to pay for it? It's LA. So, this is the real problem is, and I certainly understand why the IOC wants this clause in there, right? Is that they want to say, well, we're not going to be on the hook for this, and we're not going to have our local Olympic committee be on the hook for any unexpected costs. But it effectively makes it this bottomless pit, right? Where anything that LA 28 spends and anything that LA 28 is on the hook for, LA has to cover that, and that's just an absolute terrible situation to be in, because you can't hold them accountable for anything, right? Because then they just say, okay, hey, you just want to, the settlement from us. Here's the bill right back.
And also to your point, like we talked about this a little bit, as you were kind of going through the documents.
Yeah,
The organizing committee basically dissolves like at the
yeah,
end of the games. So, in previous games, we had kind of the surplus that rolled over into L84 Foundation that ended up like funding, all this like sports equity, play equity, some infrastructure, but mostly like programming. But we don't know the plan. We don't know what's going to happen with this organization when it's over.
yeah, absolutely. And the difference in 84, right, is that before that, I mean, the way that the IOC and the LA committee in 84 handled the fact that LA wasn't backstopping was, okay, we got to find more money, right? So Peter Ueberroth basically invented all of these, corporate sponsorships, which were not part of the Olympics at the time, and used that to, have it, run in the black and have this leftover money, and it was great. Unfortunately, since then, the Olympics now consider all that expected money, right? It's just part of the budget. So they've already accounted for that, and it's not like they can invent more corporate sponsorships they haven't before. And maybe they could, but they don't have to, right? Because they've got LA to backstop it. So it really is I will credit the 84 Olympics for, all sorts of things, but just because that was in LA and 2028 is in LA does not mean that the same conditions will exist now.
Right. And I dropped a link into something, I wrote about the invention of broadcast rights. Like we basically made that up, the
Yeah.
contemporary version of broadcast rights. that and it was so successful that the IOC immediately took it away from the
Right.
cities and said, "Oh, we'll take care of that. We'll take that money, no problem." And now you have even like sponsors that go up to the IOC level. They're like kind of the global all Olympic sponsors. And so we do have a bigger challenge. And you did write about one innovation, I guess, which was the being able to name the venues
Right.
over these with these brands. And Neil, you're the perfect person to talk about this because of your stadium expertise. But talk a little bit about like why that could be an innovation, but why it might not be like the panacea that we're looking for here when it comes to sponsorship.
Right. So it used to be that you couldn't use any corporate names, right, during the games. And that this is the one thing the IOC bent on. But naming rights are hard to sell, right? I mean, they're not. They're, there are a lot of suckers out there. But naming rights on existing buildings are hard to sell, right? So, if you want to sort of try to find a new sponsor for the course of the Olympics, it's not the same as people using that name, 365 days a year. So again, it's great, and that's a good concession that the mayor got, but it's not going to move the needle on billions of dollars, certainly.
And the way that it works is if you're already named, like they'll like SoFi, for example, is going to be called like the 2028 Stadium or something like that. I don't know. They have like all these funny names for things. And what they do is they go to SoFi and say, hey, if you want to keep your name, pay us. Otherwise, it's gonna be like a generic name.
Right, and that gets SoFi mentioned on the television, but it's not like anybody is not going to call it SoFi, right? I
Right.
mean, it's the news coverage is still going to call it SoFi probably, and people going to the games are still going to talk about it, and they know it is SoFi.
Yeah.
It's not the same as it's a marginal difference in terms of
Yeah.
what it would be worth to SoFi. So I think they'll get some money, but not a
Yeah.
ton
But the
for it.
more likely thing to happen is that some of the temporary venues or some of the city, generically named city venues, they will get sponsors, but that's not going to be the level of probably anything else that we, yeah, have. And like the Rose Bowl is not allowed to be renamed, Dodger
Right.
Stadium's not allowed to be renamed, the big ones. So, but that, yeah, so it could be funny. People were making jokes about like, oh, like Staples could come and sponsor and take away crypto.com's name. And I was like, well, no, I don't think it works that way, but that would be opportunity to do the funniest thing ever. Let's hear a little bit too about I think one other like accounting type thing, right, that we need to talk about. Hold on, let me get back to my notes over here. Um, is economic impact, right? I learned so much from your report. And, I go to all these economic impact presentations and they throw around all these other numbers. Again, like it starts to get really large and you're like, oh, billions. Okay, that sounds great. I'm going to link to like a December SCAG meeting that was. Oh, they've changed the link. All right, well, I'll find it again. But there was a great report that came out from SCAG, and you read it, and you're like, "Oh, this actually sounds really good. What is the truth about economic impact?"
Right. So the argument here is, regardless of everything else going on, how can you're getting all these people coming from out of town, right? And they're going to come here and they're going to stay here and they're going to spend, and it has to be generating lots of money, right? It's the same thing you see for a lot of sports projects, right? Build a new stadium in Kansas for the Chiefs, and all these people will come to games, and right. But for the Olympics, it's really obvious that most of the people are coming from out of town, or a huge number of people are coming from out of town. So this is something I've actually been following for a while, but I learned a lot as well during this research. When you look at an Olympics like London, and they actually studied, hey, what are the receipts for like, various different London cultural sites during the Olympic Games? Like, how much did it go up when all these new people came to town? And
Like
the
the
answer
Tower of
is
London or things like
right,
that. Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
British Museum, whatever.
Ooh, the
How many,
eye. Yeah, whatever.
how much longer with the ticket lines? And the answer is spending there went down because all the people who were coming for the Olympics were coming for the Olympics and they went to Olympic events, whereas everybody else got out of Dodge, right? I mean, anybody who lived within like 20 miles of London was like, I am, do not want to be, if they, unless they were excited to be going to the Olympics,
Right,
right?
right.
They were like, this is a perfect time to take a 3-week vacation and maybe rent out my house to somebody else who can stay there. But this has been the case in city after city, where you get this influx of new spending, but then if everybody else clears out, it ends up being roughly a wash. And if you look year over year, like what's the sales tax receipts, for an Olympic host city during the Olympics versus the same time of year the year before, and it's pretty much the same. There's no significant impact. So I'm sure the hotels will do great, obviously, right? Certain parts of certain industries will do okay, but in terms of the city as a whole and the economy, man, this is not the way to have economic impact, because you're basically turning your entire city upside down, and all you're really doing is just substituting a bunch of, normal summer activity with this abnormal activity. But you're not going to see a huge bump in, people's wages and restaurants activity and things like that because it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Also, it's one reason that we have like the Fair Games Coalition, which has been trying to advocate to raise that tourism minimum wage, so people who are working these, tourism industries can benefit. And then we also have, you'll hear like LA28 talk about how they are doing all this local procurement and making sure that like, small businesses and people who actually live here, who own businesses, are benefiting. But that's not any different than what the city of LA does for anything, really. This is like our own rules that we have.
When you look at, again, this is sports generally and these sort of big development projects. When you look at the cost per job created, the
Mm.
stuff that has a really good bang for its buck is really boring. It's like job training and education and, things that are not, do not show up on TV. But that's where you can actually get a decent return on, spend, I don't know, $25,000 or something per job. And this is some big mega events and sports mega events are a really, really expensive way to create economic development, I guess is what I'm saying. And but it's where we are now, but it's certainly, if you're talking about, as I hope people are, at least trying to LA at least trying to have an influence on how things are going to happen and try to push back a little bit on, some of the more outrageous demands. Again, we're in this situation where LA28 can kind of go, it was created by Mayor Garcetti and everyone else involved with the Olympic project, but now it's off and running and we can't even demand that Casey Wasserman step down because sorry, he's president of LA28 for life. Um, the if you're going to push back on this stuff, you need to be understanding of it's not like, well, we're getting all this windfall of economic activity, so we can't be greedy, right? It's more, this isn't really worth, this is doing more for the IOC and the Olympics. The LA is worth more to the Olympics than the Olympics is worth to
Well,
LA.
and they're even calling it America's Games now. It's not even about LA anymore. That's their way to make it seem. And I do want to ask Chris, I went to this amazing event right after Election Day at SAJE where, it was supposed to be this like teach-in about, learning about, because people even, what shocks me the most about going around the city is people who live like 2 blocks from the venues have no information whatsoever. There's been no outreach. There's been some community meetings, but there was like one in like Venice, there's like, that's not going to be very impacted at all, from any of this stuff. They just really have no idea about what's about to happen to them. And there were some workers there who worked at some of the venues who were saying, I don't want to work these mega events. I'm too scared. This was before, we saw these raids start to happen. So there's this other layer on top of it, right? That is all about, are people going to come? Are people going to want to work? Are people going to want to be out and about? And talk a little bit about what you're hearing in the community, Chris.
Yeah, of course. I think it's important to foreground too that beyond the economic costs, the potential economic costs or losses associated with this event, there's also a tremendous human and moral cost. And we know that these games historically bring increased sweeps, displacement of housed and unhoused neighbors alike, and militarized policing and security protocols all throughout the city to keep these games secure. And what we are learning as we gather more and more details around the NSSE, which is the security designation for the games. It's a federal designation, National Special Security Event. And we know that the security perimeters are going to be overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. So we know that inherently these games are bringing more ICE officers into our communities. The things that we've been hearing in the last 6 or 7 months have been increasingly alarming, and they're around specifically the security perimeters at the venues themselves, which will likely extend out not just to the sidewalk, to the street that the venue is on, but out into the community's several blocks as an inner perimeter, which means people who are living and working inside of that zone will be subject to TSA style body scans. So when you go to the airport and you got to put your hands up, you'll have to do that if you're leaving your home and you're trying to get out to your job on the other side of the city. And beyond that, there's outer perimeters, which will involve vehicle screenings, permits for anyone who is living or working in the zone, and allegedly the screening of metro buses, metro trains. All of this is to keep things secure. Specifically, I think counterterrorism efforts is how it's being sold. But again, these details are not being shared with the public. They're really only in planning meetings with various municipal actors and agencies. And this really stands to impact daily life for people all throughout 2028. And the fact that people are not being informed about what is to come, especially when the communities that live right in the shadow of these venues are historically the lowest income working class communities of color that have been disinvested from for decades within the city, we are incredibly alarmed. Sometimes it feels like we're screaming to the sky because also the details are under such lock and key that honestly, a lot of people don't believe you when you share this information out. And so that in itself gives us pause to then add an additional economic component that not only will life be disrupted so substantially for people around the venues, but also across the city for all of 2028, but also we're going to have to pay for it. And we're going to have to pay potentially billions of dollars for it on top of that so that Trump's DHS can come in here and implement any kind of security infrastructure they want to. After what we've seen since last June, it just it's untenable. And it's incredibly frustrating because the Olympics are shrouded in this veil of optimism and collaboration and kind of healthy international competition. But also they come with all of these side effects that substantially disrupt and disenfranchise people further in this city. To whose benefit, I think is the question we keep asking. Is this really for people who live in Los Angeles, or is this for the multinational corporations that are sponsoring this event that stand to really benefit from any economic output that occurs? There's also this issue of the money that is in circulation will not really be going to the small businesses, to the people in this city who are making their lives here and engaging in commerce. It's big corporations, event organizers, ticketing agencies. That's where the money is going to be spent. And I think, I think in the report you have an example of if like two billionaires get off a plane at LAX.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you share that?
Yeah, sure. So this was Victor Matheson, who's one of the economists who's looked into the Olympics and other mega events. This was when I talked to him about the Super Bowl years ago, and he was talking about the fact that sports organizations love to talk about economic impact, right? This is like how much economic impact there's going to be. But it's kind of a garbage number, right? Because it's just talking about the amount of money that changes hands. And as he said, yes, if you land a plane at the airport and everybody gets, 200 people get off the plane and each of them gives each other $1 million and they get back on the plane, that's $200 million of economic impact.
Yeah.
does not help anybody at all. So again, yes, there is spending, there is economic activity and there's economic activity. And if it's just money that's changing hands between two corporate entities that are, controlling naming rights or TV rights or something like that, and it never goes to pay any actual workers, then that is not, who live in LA. That's not relevant, right, to actual, residents. So
And with these zones, I'm hearing like up to a mile around some of the major venues, right? That you'll have these, they are calling them things like, like a blast perimeter, right? They're thinking of like these terrorism and thinking through this and these terrorism terms, but that's why we have car-free games. It's so vehicles can't get close to the venues. That's the kind of our reality. But when you look at, we don't have like our type of agreement.
Well,
Yeah,
some vehicles will get close to the venues, but
right.
not
Yeah.
vehicles of working class, middle
Right.
class
Exactly.
people in
Yeah.
this
Right.
city. Yeah.
And we don't have our type of agreement yet to compare, but if you look at like Long Beach's agreement, it actually calls them like clean zones, right? Where you're not only making sure that there's no cars, there's no advertising, you can kind of deliver it with like a blank advertising screen, something we've got to talk about soon here on Torch. Even like street vendors, unhoused people, right? You're thinking about like you're going to be displacing people and commerce, no matter what, the informal economy. So yeah, much more than just like saying like, is money actually going to trickle down? Um, how are we going to be able to see this for, like you said, for regular people, these types of benefits? So there is a really good question, and we'll go back to the history real quickly because I do think this is kind of relevant, and then we'll get into the recommendations you're making for city leaders today. Good question. If we could get rid of it, where would it go? Would someone take it at this late date? I guess that means for 2028. Like, and there is no real precedent, although we did we did learn of one, Neil, that we the the
oh, the
Rome
one in 2008, sorry, 1908.
1908. We learned of
Right.
that after the report.
Right.
But
That it was Naples, right?
it was, so yeah, it was
Mount
Mount
Vesuvius
Vesuvius
erupted.
erupted and they moved it to London with less than 2 years' time. So there's your indicator.
And there is in the report the Commonwealth Games that were going to be in Australia, and they backed it in 2026 this year, and they backed out in 2023, little more time, but not incredibly more time. And they did pick them up and move them to British Columbia, scaled them back, right? So, I mean, I, the short answer to that is that this is not Los Angeles's problem, right? It's not up to Los Angeles to figure out where the Olympics are going to be held. I think the longer answer is, I mean, Paris just hosted the Olympics, Tokyo just hosted the Olympics. There's a lot of places with a lot of Olympic venues that still exist. Um, would it be scaled back? Probably. Would it, what would it look like? I don't know, but there that's for the IOC to figure out. And if, excuse me, again, if you're talking about not just getting out of the Olympics, right, but about trying to get some sort of concessions, about trying to get some sort of guarantees, about trying to get some sort of control over this, almost invasion force that's coming, right? Um, then if it's the case that it's really LA or nowhere, then you have leverage, right? I mean, it would be the IOC's. I mean, even if they could move it somewhere else, it would be the IOC's worst nightmare to have to move the Olympics out of LA. LA would survive, right? LA would, it would be a little bit of a black eye, maybe, although maybe not. Maybe people would be inspired by, wow, you stood up to, the IOC and ICE and everybody else. But LA would be LA. LA would be fine. Denver was fine after they backed out of the Olympics. Um, but the IOC really does not want to have there be any speed bumps. And I think they are going to, so far, they've just been like, well, contract's a contract, you agreed to this, you got to do it. If, LA just threw up its hands and said, well, you know what? We don't have your $3 billion in security money. Guess you're not going to have any cops. Have fun. I think, the IOC officials would have to respond, right?
Yeah.
Because like what are they going to do? It's even if they sued, that doesn't, enable them to put on the games the way they
And
want
that
to.
would
So
look
they,
so bad. Yeah. I
yeah.
have an anecdote in the link I just dropped when it was after the fires and everybody was like, can they still do this? can LA still host? There's the learning from what happened in Tokyo in 2020, which eventually
Right.
got relocated to 2021. Apparently, they came to LA and asked, well, would you, if they don't want to do it, would you be willing to do it? And the leaders here said, yes, of course, during a pandemic, no problem. But they're always looking for backups. They had backups for some of the venues in Milan that weren't quite finished. Some of the gondola still didn't get finished, but I think they're always thinking about that. It's not like they're going to let it like,
Maybe Oklahoma City can scale up.
yeah, Oklahoma City
Yeah.
can take on a majority of everything else. Um, so let's go quickly before we get to our Q&A, the recommendations. So at the beginning of the report, and I have them kind of queued up right here at the beginning of my story if you want to look, there's these four recommendations. And I think this is really important to point out now because you have at least five council members. The deal is with the city of LA. LA 28's host agreement is with the city of LA. There are at least five council members right now who are calling on LA 28 to excuse Casey Wasserman from the board. They're making some very specific demands. And two of those council members put forth a resolution really demanding more transparency and more accountability. So we do have this kind of interesting hinge, I guess, where there's leverage that could be applied here. Can you talk us through these four recommendations and what should happen from the city's perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think fundamentally, before we can engage this conversation any further, we need to understand what this thing is actually going to cost. And if you look at the budget that LA 28 puts out, the costs exactly match the revenue
Right.
raised. And we're talking $7+ billion here. So these numbers are so huge, it's easy to feel like they're slightly abstract because most of us don't have access to that kind of capital in our daily lives. But we don't know what each line item really means, what kind of cost it's going to incur. We don't know the sources or methodologies for these projections. And so, how can we have any kind of accurate sense of what is on the line here if we don't have those numbers, which is to say nothing of all of the off budget costs that you spoke about earlier? Alissa, the costs with the security and policing, municipal services, sanitation, traffic control, city staffing, et cetera, et cetera. And as we know, they can't even really agree on what those costs are and at what rate they should be determined. So I think fundamentally, knowing that there's this sort of sense that this is a foregone conclusion, that the Olympics are inevitable, and it has been that way since 2017, where we negotiated. I mean, we signed that agreement in 11 days. We signed an agreement that put the city on the hook for potentially billions of dollars. And we said, there's no real leverage we have here. We have to sign this to have this great honor of the games. And we're going to do that in 11 days' time. So we want to remind everyone that, as Neil has detailed throughout this report, this is not an impossibility. That is not to say that it is without consequence if we were to cancel. It is without cost. But we also know that there are substantial consequences and costs associated with hosting. And I think what we want more than anything is real leadership from our city leaders and a sober and honest conversation with the people who live here about what is actually on the line, what we may or may not be liable for, and to determine what that liability actually is in any number of potential outcomes. And until we have that honest, sober conversation and acknowledge the fact that this is not simply something that will inevitably generate a huge profit because that's what happened in 1984 when the terms of the agreement were completely different, we're not going to be able to engage this issue in the way that the people of this city deserve. And so I think that is fundamentally the thing we want to understand. How do we mitigate the worst damage in any possible scenario? And what is our actual liability here in the instance of cancellation or in the instance of hosting?
Neil, anything to add to that?
No, I mean I think that's absolutely the basics, right? I mean, and I think that's why they don't share all those numbers, right? I mean that LA 28 budget is it's what economists I know refer to as a clown document, right? Because it's something you put out just as PR, right? It's like, oh, here we've got a nice little chart, and it shows that the amount of money that we spent is equal to the amount of money that will come in. There's no sourcing, there's no information about, there's no like error bars about like how much, what the potential overruns could be. It's just like, oh, here, the inflow and the outflow. And it's PR, right? It doesn't have anything to do. I mean, it may have some connection to reality, but we don't know because they don't have to produce any kind of methodology or footnotes or anything. So yeah, I think the first step would be, okay, if you want us to continue to move forward, you have to at least open your books, right? You have to at least show us everything that's, going to be spent both within LA 28 and without, right? Let's sit down and because that's what I was trying to do for this report was figure out, okay, what's the actual cost and how much is being spent? And the answer is nobody's keeping track. And that's just not okay for a, multi-billion dollar project that is going to turn the city upside down.
And it's literal what you said. Like it is like a one-page document that says their budget that they put out publicly. It is just like a little Excel document, and that's it.
Yeah.
Like yeah,
Usually
Yeah.
at least, they pad it out with a bunch of like, photos and like, make it like a 30-page PDF.
right.
But this is not even that, it's just like what basically you can tell that their response was, well, we're required to provide something. So,
Yeah.
let's provide like an 8-line chart
And
and,
for example, like one, yeah, there really is like 8 lines. For the most expensive thing, for example, it has been said that they're going to put a new floor in the bottom of the Coliseum for track and field because we can't use what's
right.
there. So that's been talked about, like, in these talking points as something that's the most expensive thing they have to do. But we still don't know the
How
cost for
much it's
that.
gonna
Like we
cost.
don't,
I
I mean,
know.
that's not our cost, but that's just like the biggest budget items, for example, in their budget. So it's just like, okay, like that's the most expensive thing.
And if it goes way over budget, it is our
Right.
cost,
Like what
right?
if, yeah,
That's the thing.
what
Every
if you
cost
can't
here
do
is
it? Yeah.
potentially our cost.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's pretty much. So this is a really
And
good kind of breakdown of just these, mostly financial and like fiscal responsibility breakdowns, itemizations, like all these things. And then there's the last one is a really interesting, proposal is to strategize about the how to lessen the damage on the budget, but maybe doing a scaled back version. Can you talk a little bit about like what could the city leaders do to say, we don't maybe just like, take it down a notch or something like that. Like, and you talked about the Commonwealth Games, for example, where they did a scaled back version.
Yeah, no, and I mean, there's no law about what the Olympics has to consist of, right? And they could reduce the number of events. They could, consolidate some, right? So you don't have to have a different venue for every single one. They could reduce the number of, watch parties and all sorts of other things, that are sort of ancillary stuff that goes on around the Olympics. Again, that isn't necessarily the goal here, right? I mean, if there's a way to do all that without costing LA a whole lot of money and a lot of, security checks when you walk out your door, then that's fine. But it should be on the table, right? I mean, you should be able to negotiate for, okay, we're hosting this thing, let's talk about what it's going to look like rather than just, okay, we've accepted that we are going to do whatever it takes to do whatever the Olympics wants.
Yeah.
So I mean, it absolutely is something that's negotiable again, I mean, look at, Tokyo was able to negotiate moving to a whole different year. And the IOC would have to scale back considerably if it were not in LA. So I certainly think it's something you can ask for. Again, a lot of this just really talk is about LA accepting, like I said, two things. One is that it has a responsibility to try to rein in the power of LA 28 and the IOC and like say, okay, we need really more of a seat at the table. And the other is that it's a uh you're not risking, something. Again, it's the idea that the Olympics needs LA as much as the LA or more than the LA needs the
Yeah.
Olympics.
I love that.
You do have leverage.
Yeah.
Again, does that make it easy? No. Does that mean you get everything you want? Probably not. Does it mean that you can get something? Yes, and those somethings may be important.
I have an idea. How about just not doing a cultural Olympiad since we're not really doing it anyway? Maybe we just continue not doing it.
I don't think that's where the money's being spent. I'm going to go out on a limb here.
So here's some really good questions. We should do a cultural Olympiad. That would be awesome. No, I was joking. People would not, but I'm saying like the planning is and fundraising is apparently so behind for the cultural Olympiad now. So it's like, I mean, is that going to be something that's, we might be sacrificing? It's kind of a bummer.
You look,
Um,
but look at it from not to go into it long,
yeah,
but
yeah.
look at it from just a city budget perspective, right? If the budget is over, if there's a budget deficit, you look and see what are we spending money on and what can we save on. There's no way to do that right now for the
Right,
Olympics.
exactly. I'll go to this question first. Is there time for a ballot item to restrict the exposure to city budget that could go through? There's no leadership. We are doing charter reform right now. There's commission that's been meeting. There could be a charter amendment that would be made. I don't know.
I mean, so you would have to do a charter amendment to block any expenditure to cover LA 28's costs that they couldn't cover. And that would mean abrogating the host city contract, right? I am not a lawyer. I do not know what happens if the city signs a contract to do something and then a ballot initiative passes saying, no, we are not going to do that thing. I expect if I asked a lawyer, I would get the answer, well, that would be an interesting case.
Time to lawyer up. But yeah, I guess there is a window since it was done, through in the some of the stuff would be going on the ballot this, November. So, maybe, but it's really not in any part of the conversations that I've seen. Really good question from Nat. I'm going to save that to the end. Carrie Ann, do you want to just come on and you can, I don't know what you can either unmute or where are you?
Yeah, I can unmute. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. One of our previous Torch Talk speakers, an amazing researcher on all of this.
Well, thank you. I love this report. I'm loving this conversation. I I've seen these magical economic impact report numbers show up at every mega event, right? And even in LA, we've seen smaller ones for things like the Super Bowls, the NBA All-Star game, every single time. And I know there's sort of at least two different groups of actors. There's like the consultant groups that are paid to make these reports, and I think that's their job, right? So they're going to continue doing it. But there's also the journalists, and I'm interested in talking a little bit and getting your perception on the role of journalists in this, because every time one of these reports comes out, I see dozens of outlets, sometimes just people republishing the same thing, maybe one or two outlets actually wrote up. But yeah, just repeating the headline, right? Of Super Bowl will bring this much money to LA. Olympics will bring this much money to LA. So, Neil, I'm curious, have you seen anything work to attempt to kind of just get into journalists' heads, maybe in particular, about sort of how do we counteract this kind of myth? Because I just see it going on and on, even though, as you said, the economic research is there. It exists. Economists have been saying this for a long time. That's not how those numbers really work.
Yeah, I mean, it's rough, right? Especially right now because journalism is not in its glory days. The J.C. Bradbury, the economist who came up with that clown document thing, is constantly tearing his hair out on social media about the terrible, terrible press coverage. And he's like, I can't believe this is something that has been disproven for 40 years, right? And yet people are taking it as if it's gospel, right? And his dad was a newspaper man. So he is like, I understand how journalism works here. It's not supposed to be like this. You're not supposed to just, take the press release and then print it in the paper. I think LA has a little bit better case than maybe a smaller city in that it still has more than one news outlet, right? It maybe doesn't have as many as it used to, and maybe they're getting gutted, but at least there are, if it's not like if the LA Times doesn't cover it, then nobody else is going to cover it because they're the only game in town. So I mean, I think you have to keep pressuring people, and I think calls, to media organizations from readers and listeners and viewers do make a difference, right? You actually call and you say, I would like to speak to the newsroom. I would like to speak to the person responsible for this story. Especially, I've done some work with the Media Watch Group, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting over the years, and they're always like, if you see something on the TV and it's wrong, call right in and say, I would like you to correct this the next time it comes around. And that will often happen, right? Because it's not just that the journalists are dedicated to just doing whatever the IOC or LA 28 wants, although there's some of that. A lot of it is just they've got 10 stories to write in a day and they don't have the time to research, right? And to actually say, oh, are these economic claims actually correct? So I think that sort of pressure is important. And I think the pressure of, if the LA Times ignores this, then somebody else is going to scoop them and eat their lunch. Again, as much as the LA Times may be in bed with the Olympics and as much as the LA Times may not be interested in spending the resources on reporting this, it makes a huge difference, when you are, I remember, and I live in New York City, and I remember when Newsday, the Long Island paper, started a New York edition in the 80s and 90s. And suddenly the New York Times local coverage got so much better because they were, again, the Newsday's ad campaign was, because it was the Times, the Daily News, and Newsday. It was like their ad campaign was on top of the news and ahead of the Times.
Very
And the
good.
Times took that very seriously. When New York Newsday went out of business in the early 2000s, the Times immediately was like, well, we're not covering city news
Yeah.
anymore.
And don't worry, we've got the California Post now, so I'm sure we have
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
really accurate and
Shout
wonderful.
out, shout
I
out California
I
Post.
will give one actual shout out. Libby Rady is doing an amazing job at LAist, really staying on top of
Yeah.
this. And, people answer her
Yes.
questions, unlike mine. So she still has a good level of access while being critical and really talking to the people that this matters to most. Please throw in any other questions. I'll have this. I'll ask Matt's now because I do think it's good, and then we can any other questions, of course. But if you could wave a magic wand, um, what would be the outcome for 2020? I'll start with Chris because I know your answer
I'll,
already.
I'll just share
Yeah.
this message. It's
There you
probably
go.
reversed right now, but that would be my magic outcome for sure. I mean, the reality is this is going to cost us a lot in either direction. And only one of these outcomes, which is hosting, also involves a huge federal incursion on our streets. And so, economic costs aside, that is the thing that I think we are fundamentally most concerned about. And there is no way to have these games either at scale or scaled back that will not involve intensive collaboration with DHS and the Secret Service. So, we don't want these to happen. I don't want these to happen. That is sort of the whole organizing philosophy of the No Olympics LA coalition. It's not maybe Olympics and not yes Olympics. It's no Olympics. And I think it can feel like such a huge, tremendous impossibility in some ways, but at the same time, I think we've all lived through the last year and a half, and have witnessed things that are stranger and more violent and more troubling than maybe we even thought possible, even on election night 2024. So yes, we would like these games to be canceled, and we would like some leadership to bring us through these conversations that need to be had to look at what this is actually going to mean for the people who live in Los Angeles.
Can I use my magic wand to make a TARDIS? Because I think my ideal would be
Yes.
to go back in time to 1978, pick up Tom Bradley, take him to 2017, and have him smack Eric Garcetti upside the head and say, "You might want to take more than 11 days on this." Barring that, yeah, I mean, I think it's almost not about the best case scenario as avoiding the worst case scenarios, right? There's like any amounts of things that would be significant harm reduction, whether that's trying to find ways of scaling, of keeping some control over the budget, of keeping some control over, what the events are going to look like, of keeping some control over what the security is going to look like, and right now, LA just does not have control over any of that, and it could be really, really bad. I would consider it, as much as if I were, living in LA, I would be like, just please make this whole thing go away. I would consider it a huge success if, there were some scaling back of some of these security protocols, if there was some scaling back of expenses, if there was just more transparency right now. But any of that would be so much better than where things are now. And, if the LA Council came out tomorrow and said, we are going to put LA 28's feet to the fire, we're going to demand that we at least get uh, it's almost like, saying, what would you like the Senate Democrats to do about Trump, Uh, Make him go away would be great, but I'm not expecting that. But there are so many things that you could get that would be somewhere in between the worst case scenario and that I would love to see, any of these things happen. And I think there are at least uh potentially doable, right? I would not have said that in this report if I thought that this was pie in the sky stuff and you could never actually accomplish anything, because I do think that there's ways to push back, and or at very worst, push back and see what happens. I mean, what do you have to lose, really?
Yeah, and somebody in the comments used this phrase forever games, which I've used, which I know is an Olympics talking point as well. Like, don't even think that this is over in 2028. Like, they are booking more and more events. They're not very big at the convention center anymore, but they are other big sporting events and other things that we are continuing to say that we are this like world-class world event hosting, city. To be determined, I guess. But like, this isn't over in 2 years. I think that's something to think about. Like, organizing against this one event is not really the end game here. Great question
Also,
here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
can I just add quickly? I think, again, I am not a lawyer. I cannot make recommendations about how the city should approach any kind of negotiation with LA 28. But looking at the news cycle right now, this is certainly a hinge moment in that organization, and hinge moments beget leverage. So I think it would be important to also look at the like overall landscape and what is being said about the organization and its leadership, and consider whether this would be a strategic moment to have some of these harder conversations that need to be had.
Yeah, and I thought Neil's point was really good when and I asked him, and your sentiments were almost completely echoed exactly by Connie Rice, who is the civil rights attorney who's been out there being like, get the agreement in place, like trying to make sure we're not going to be on the hook for billions of dollars. It doesn't really matter if Casey Wasserman stays or goes. The problem is a bad contract that we signed a decade ago with LA 28, and that's what needs to be fixed. And I think that's like, keep your eyes on the prize, right? Type of a thing.
Absolutely.
Really good question just at the end. Is there any opportunity for a lasting Olympic legacy to be delivered to the residents of Los Angeles? Housing, transport in today's America? Are those objectives no longer central? We talk about all that time here on Torch. We're going to get some. I don't really know if they would have been done or not if the Olympics hadn't come here, because we're not meeting the deadlines for
Yeah,
them in many cases.
things like the Olympics move some stuff to the top of the agenda and move other stuff to the bottom, So it's like
Great way to
you
put
can
it.
point to the thing and say, "Oh, we never would have had this if we hadn't had the Olympics." But then, what else could we have had if LA had been spending its time focusing on other priorities? So again, it's not like there's no benefits that ever come out of the games. The question is it worth what you're spending on it?
And that is a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Neil. Thanks to everyone for joining on this rainy Thursday afternoon. Continue to read and send me all of your tips. I rely on your tips to keep Torch going and also become a paid subscriber. Thanks, everyone. See you next
Thank
time.
you.
Bye.
Bye.